Hey there, I thought I would make a recording of the first class in case you needed a refresher or if you missed class. So I'll go through it pretty quickly. My name is Andrea Ferenchek, and I have been doing this since about 2004. I won't go into all the details, but basically my kids were born, I got a camera, and I've been taking classes ever since. Um, I use Lightroom to import all my pictures, but up until 2010, I used what was built into Windows. So make sure you know how to import your photos to your computer. And if you don't know how to do that, YouTube is a great reference. Just say, how do I import my pictures from my camera onto my PC or my Mac? And I'm sure somebody has written a tutorial. But basically, I'm always taking classes, always watching videos, always learning. I just have a real passion for photography. And then this summer in July, I opened a portrait business, and I've also done a lot of corporate and concert photography kind of on a freelance basis over the past 4 years. So when I look back, I've actually been doing this quite a long time, and I know quite a bit about the camera technicalities. So the purpose of this class, it's only 3 weeks, so there's only so much that we can get through, but the idea is that you begin to learn your camera inside and out. And I like to compare it to a tennis serve. It's kind of one step forward, two steps back. So if you are a tennis player, think about the little dink serve that you've got. You're never going to get any better unless you try a different kind of serve. And you know that when you try a different serve, it gets really, really bad. And some people just revert back to the easy serve because they can't take the ugly serve, right? So it's kind of the same with photography. You can shoot on auto, but you're never really going to get any better. You've got to take some ugly pictures and learn what's going on in order to take much better pictures. And then secondly, and it's just as important, you need to learn to see. So take better pictures on any camera, whether it's your iPhone, a point and shoot. It doesn't really matter if you've probably seen people on Instagram, they just have a little iPhone and they're making these amazing pictures, and it's because they understand composition and color and things like that. So learning to see differently will also help you in conjunction with learning your camera. So there's so many, like I said before, there's only so much we can cover in 3 weeks, and there's so many different elements of photography. So this is a little rubric I found in a forum that I'm in, and they use this to judge whether someone's ready to be a pro. And they use lots of different things, but we're really only going to focus in this class on the exposure triangle, and that's basically making sure your pictures are not too dark, they're not too bright, they're just right. And then we're going to learn the technical basics, how to get things in focus, and how to control your depth of field, which is basically how much is in focus in your picture, and you'll learn more about that in just a minute. And then a little bit on composition, how you can start to make your pictures better as you're learning the technical details. Now beyond that, and way beyond the scope of this class, is color and white balance. So making sure your skin tones are natural. If you're shooting in an inside gym, your whites are white, not yellow. Things like that. Use of light, that's many courses in and of itself. But I'd say once you master your camera, if you're very interested in getting into photography, the next thing you want to do is learn to master natural light. That's important because no matter how good of a handle you have on your camera, if you're putting your subject in really bad light, it won't make a difference. You're still going to get a bad picture. And then you move on to processing, which is whether you're putting it in Photoshop or Lightroom and liken it to a filter on Instagram. You've probably seen people adding like a filter and then the skin look green or it looks really weird and they're like, ooh, there's a filter, but it's actually not that good. So there's developing kind of a polish to your photos, but that's, again, well beyond the scope of this class. And then once you sort of master all those things, the light, the camera, your processing, you can start to really think about creative expression and intention and telling stories with your pictures and adding drama, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's, you can just keep going on forever, and that's why it's so much fun if you're really into it, because you can never stop learning. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail here. I've posted another video on the weekly assignment that explains it and shows you how to upload your pictures, so make sure to take a look at that. And on that video, I also tell you a little bit more about these numbers, the f-stop, the shutter speed, and the ISO. These three numbers are very important, so watch the video to figure out how you get those and include them with the assignment, because we can break down why a picture looks like it does by these three numbers. And I know you probably don't understand that right now, but it's going to make a lot of sense at the end of this class. So I always like to start with the basics because I never know where people are coming from, but the most important thing is you've got to learn to import, backup, and clear your card every single time you have kind of an event, I call it. So you go out and shoot a soccer game, you come back in, you import it, you name it, you back it up, and you clear your card. So you don't want to take the chance of having 2 years worth of pictures on your card and then losing your camera. Okay, so you always want to get those pictures off that card and start over. You also need a really good system of organizing your photos, because I currently have well over 100,000 pictures. If I didn't have a system and I hadn't started with a system, I would never be able to find anything. But I guarantee you, if you ask me for a picture, I can find it. And I'll show you what that method is, but really you just need to find something that works for you. And then backing up regularly is important. I recommend a couple different services, and one is Carbonite and one is Backblaze. They're both fairly inexpensive. It's an annual subscription. And what it does is it automatically backs up your computer, so you don't have to remember to back it up. So Dropbox is great, but if you forget to put your pictures in there and then your house burns down, there go your pictures. Here in Carbonite or Backblaze, it's constantly backing up. God forbid your house burns down, you just call Carbonite and they send you a hard drive with all your pictures. I actually had this happen. All of my pictures from 2000 until 2013 were on a hard drive that died on an old computer that I had, and fortunately I had them backed up to Carbonite, and now I have a hard drive with essentially 13 years worth of pictures, almost my kid's entire childhood since cameras went digital. So thank God I had that, and I want everybody else to have that as well. And then, like I said before, if you don't know how to import your pictures, check out YouTube for a tutorial, and if that doesn't help, come and ask me and I'll help you, because it's really important that you know how to do that before you leave this class. And I always encourage printing your pictures. I like to make books. All right, so let's start here. When you organize, look at this. CMG 0026, CMG 0027. How will you ever find your pictures in 10 years if they are organized like this? I can tell you, you won't. So what I like to do is I like to, every year, once a year, so for 2018, I just created a 2018 folder, and then for the rest of the year, I import all of my pictures into that folder. So you can see here I have 2000, 2001, blah, blah, blah. Now you come over here and you put year, month, date, and then a description of what you might be looking for, say 10 years from now. So let's envision the scenario. You're making a senior class slideshow for your child, and you want to pull all their pictures from childhood. So you can easily go back and you can identify what's in these folders, okay? So you use something that just makes sense to you. What would you call it if you're looking for it? And that's how you describe that. And then you can search your whole hard drive and easily come up with pictures that you're looking for. And I've been doing this ever since I went digital, and it's been a great success. But like I said, find what works for you and then stick with it. And then the other tip that I have is don't go backwards, because if you have 30,000 pictures, they're not organized, don't start doing it now. You'll get frustrated, you'll stop, you'll never go back. Just start today and go forward and worry about what's behind you later, once you kind of have the hang of it. Here I've got pictures and I've renamed them, but really once you have your folders described, it doesn't really matter if you rename your individual pictures, because you'll be able to find it from the folder location. So there's a couple things, we kind of already talked about this, but how do you become a better photographer? Well, first of all, you've got to know your camera inside and out, and I like to say be able to shoot in the dark. You've got to know where all your buttons are, what your menus mean. That's really the first start. Once you're comfortable with that, I would say the next thing you need to do is understand light, and then know the rules so you can break them. The composition rules, the there's lots of rules out there, and you don't always have to do them, but it's important to know what they are so you can intentionally break them if you want to do something artistic or whatever. And then really, you've got to practice, practice, practice. It's no different than sports. Some of you will pick it up easily. Some will have to work really hard. Some of you will have a natural eye. Some people will have to read books and look at what other people have done in order to teach their eye to see differently. But if you don't practice, you're not going to get any better. So just keep at it. And that's the best advice I can give, is just take pictures as much as you can. And then you'll have something to look back on and say, oh my gosh, I was so bad, but now look how good I am. It's kind of a good feeling. So I have some vocabulary words for you, and the first one is exposure. Now exposure, I'm going to jump ahead one slide, is really just sort of that middle ground, not too bright, not too dark. So when I say exposure, you're getting all of the elements in the picture correctly exposed. So I would say this middle one is a correct exposure of my cute little nephews. This one is too bright, there's too much light, and this one is too dark, there's too little light. Now, let's go back to this. Your camera is like a little computer, all right? And it's programmed to add up all the pixels in the scene and say, you know what, I need all those pixels to add up to 18% gray. Now, you don't really need to know what that means, just know that it's programmed to kind of put it in the middle, right? So there's things that can mess up your camera, and that's why not shooting on auto and understanding your camera is so important. So let's picture this. This is a snow scene, okay? So the camera looks at all this white and it says, oh, but I'm supposed to make it gray. It's supposed to be 18% gray. So if you've ever taken pictures in the snow and they've turned out gray, that's why. Now let's jump over here to black. Say this is a really dark sunset. It's very orange. The sun looks really cool. You pop your camera on auto and you take a picture of it, and it sees all this black and it wants to make it gray. So what does it do? It brightens up the sunset, and it's not anything like what you see with your eye. So it's just doing what it's told. The camera's being told, make it 18% gray. So when you know how to override these settings and manually, you'll get white snow and you'll get dark, rich sunsets. But you have to understand how to do that, and that's what we're going to try to do in this class. So let's go ahead. The other term that you're going to hear a lot is depth of field, and don't let that scare you. All depth of field means is how much of the picture is in focus. So if you take a look at this picture, I was just sitting here at my desk and I opened this picture I opened this magazine, and I put my camera on a very shallow depth of field, and we'll learn about this in week 2. But f-stop 1.8 is very, very shallow. We call it wide open. And I focused on this girl right here. You can see that everything in front of her is out of focus, and everything behind her is starting to fall out of focus. So in these very back row and front row, you can't even identify the person, or even the second row, even the third row. You can't identify who that person is, and then they start to come in focus the closer you get to the focal point or where I was focusing. So we call that a shallow depth of field, and there's a lot you can do with that. You can make pictures look really, really neat, and it's one of the ways that you can differentiate a picture taken with your DSLR versus your iPhone. Now let's come over here. This is that same picture. I'm focusing on that same girl right here, but because I have a very large depth of field, I've changed my aperture, and you're going to learn about this in week 2, to f22. You can see I can clearly see everyone in the front row all the way to the back row because I've got a very large depth of field. Everything in the picture from front to back is in focus. And so that's the difference between a shallow depth of field and a large depth of field. Now we're going to go over what all those camera buttons mean, and everybody in the class has different cameras. There's lots of different makes and models. Most of the entry-level consumer cameras are going to have something similar to this button or dial on top. Some of your mid, like prosumer cameras, your Canon 7Ds, I don't know what the Nikon middle of the road is, will not have some of these creative modes. They kind of get rid of that because people who are more experienced or pro don't use those. But let's talk about what this means. So looking on your dial, probably every camera has this green A, and the green A is fully automatic. It just means that you have no control over anything. The camera's choosing how it's exposed, where it's focusing, what the settings are. It's just like using your iPhone, essentially. There's no difference. The only reason your pictures might look a little better than your iPhone is because you have probably a nice lens on there that's going to change the way it looks. However, if you're using kind of a wide angle lens for a landscape, there probably won't be a ton of difference between the iPhone and the DSLR. You really start to see a difference when you use longer lenses. Now let's talk about these creative modes. Creative modes are still 100% controlled by the camera, but you're just giving it a hint as to what you're looking for. So let's talk about that for just a second. So portrait mode is usually represented by a little head or a little face here. And what the camera is trying to do is putting your subject. And even though it says portrait, don't be thrown off by that. This could easily be a water bottle, okay? In this case, it's two girls, but it could be a water bottle. So you can see they are in focus, and then the background is out of focus. And that's what you're saying you want. You put it on portrait, you're saying, I have something or someone that I would like to be the focus of my picture, and I would like everything in the background to be out of focus. Now there's lots of different factors that are going to affect whether that happens or not. But you're giving your camera a hint, but the camera itself is still completely in control. Now let's jump over here. Oops, I just see I have a little mistake. This mountain should be circled here. I'll have to fix that. So the mountain is a landscape. And what the landscape is if you think back to depth of field, here we have a shallow depth of field because everything is blurry. Here, all the way from the front of the plane, all the way to the mountains, is completely in focus. The wing, the mountains, the plane itself. And so landscape is saying, I want everything in focus. And again, your camera is completely in control here, but you're telling it, hey, I'm taking a picture of something that I want in focus. And that's what it's going to try to do. Now action. The action button is the little running man. And that's pretty consistent across most cameras. And what that's trying to do is freeze the action. But I'm going to tell you, this one might frustrate you. If you use this mode, say in an indoor sport like basketball, volleyball, wrestling, you might be very frustrated because you're saying, hey, I've got it on action mode and all my pictures are blurry. You know, this camera stinks. Well, it's not the camera's fault. This really works best when you have lots and lots of light. Most everything works best when you have a lot of light, quite honestly. So you're always going to have more difficulty when the light gets low. But action, what it tries to do is it takes your shutter speed up very high, so it freezes all these little drops of water, it freezes hands. We're not getting any blurriness here. Everything is tack sharp. And that's what action tries to do. But again, there's so many variables. That's why it can be frustrating if you don't understand what those variables are if you're not getting the results that you want. Now macro. Macro is this little flower. But don't let the flower throw you. It can be anything. This just means you're trying to do something close up. For instance, here I've got these straws. Here I've got a picture of my house and a little water droplet. This attempts to take a picture close up, and you get all the detail, and then the background just sort of falls out of focus here. And then we're just trying to get in close. And again, this is going to, there's so many factors into this, but that's what that button means. Now low light, here on this camera it has a low light with a little person, and that means low light portrait. And so low light is just like it sounds, but this mode is really going to frustrate you if you don't understand what's going on, because what it's doing is it's slowing down your shutter because it's letting more light in, okay? Because if you just take a picture really fast, it'll just be black. So it's letting the shutter open, letting the light flow in for a second. But if you're not using a tripod or you're not using a steady chair or something to put your camera on, you're likely to get very blurry pictures, and then you'll be frustrated. You'll think your camera doesn't work, but it's just because you can't move your camera during this because it's letting light in and drawing the picture. And if you're moving around, it's going to draw a blurry picture. And we'll go over that the week of we talk about shutter speed. Now in low light portrait, it's kind of the same idea where you want to let the background light in, but it's going to pop your flash and give your subject some light. So if you've ever used an iPhone and you've taken a picture in a dark place and the flash blasts them with light and then everything else is black in the back, that's what this is trying to avoid. But again, you're going to get very frustrated because if you're not on a tripod, you're going to get a blurry background and you're going to get these guys really blasted with light. So you have to learn to kind of what you need to do to get for optimal results. Now we're going to go over to the semi-manual modes, and this is really where the focus of the class is going to be. We're going to spend week 2 in aperture priority and week 3 in shutter priority. We'll talk a lot about full manual, but we won't really learn it because it's beyond the scope of a 3-week class. It's really a 4-week class in and of itself. So the first one is aperture priority. And on your cameras, that is usually for Canon, it's AV. But for most every other Nikon, Sony, pretty sure Fuji, it's A for aperture. So AV for Canon, A for just about everybody else. And that means you're choosing your aperture, which we're going to learn all about that next week. So don't worry if you don't understand what that means, but it basically means I'm choosing in this picture to keep this metal in focus, and then I want everything else to fall out of focus because I want the emphasis to be on the subject, which is the metal. And so I'm controlling the aperture. I'm setting it to a very shallow depth of field, and then I'm letting the camera handle the rest of the exposure. So I'm getting a lot more control, but I still don't know have to know how everything works in full manual because the camera is going to do a lot of the work for me. Now same with shutter priority over here. Here it's the same thing, but I'm choosing a very slow shutter speed because I want to paint with light. So I'm letting the light come in long enough that I'm able to paint the numbers that you see here. And you can see in the background the people are a little bit blurry, but mostly you can just see the writing here. And so you can do that, and we're going to learn about how to do this in week 3 in our shutter priority class. Now ISO, if you remember in the film days when you bought if you're younger you won't remember this, but in the film days you'd buy a roll of film and there'd be 100, 200, 400, 1600, and you'd buy it based on where you were going to shoot. So if you were on a bright sunny day, you'd buy a roll of 100 film. If you were just kind of in and out, inside, outside, a roll of 400 film would suffice. If you were going to be shooting sports, you'd probably buy a 1600 film. And what that means is the film was more sensitive to light, and so that's what your ISO is. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive it is to light. It lets more light in, and that's important when you have a lot of dark scenes and you're trying to get more light. But it comes at a cost. If you zoom in on this picture, it's a little hard to see on a smaller screen, but on a big screen you can see a lot of digital noise, a lot of colors, and a lot of flecks of color, and that's called digital noise. And the higher you go on your ISO, especially with older cameras, the more noisy it gets, to the point sometimes the picture is no good. And you've probably seen this on your iPhone. If you've ever taken a picture in a dark restaurant or a movie theater and everything looks kind of grainy and fuzzy, that's digital noise. So raising your ISO and getting more light doesn't come without a cost. So just kind of keep that in mind, and we'll talk a lot more about this this week. All right, now full manual, and you're thinking, why on earth would I ever use full manual? Well, there are situations where it's extremely helpful to know what you're doing. In this case over here, this was shot at the Georgia Tech Aquatic Center. So it's indoor lights that were kind of funky color, so I wanted to control the color of the lights. I wanted to stop the action. I wanted to blur my background to keep my focus on the swimmer. And so I set all of these things independently until I got the perfect exposure, and then it was consistent from picture to picture. It wasn't varying at all. Now over here, I wanted to keep the singer in focus, but you can see I've got massively changing lighting over here. Lights swirling everywhere. I've got a spotlight here. This will just make your camera sensor go crazy because if it's on aperture priority or shutter priority, it's constantly making adjustments for every time the light changes, which would make it impossible to get a great photo. So what you want to do is you want to set it for him, and then you let this be as it may. It'll change around, and it doesn't make your sensor jump all over the place. And so you can really control the results that you're getting. And then one more example of why you might use manual, and we won't really talk about this because it's a lot of information, but in this very simple picture, we set our aperture because we wanted a big depth of field. We wanted it all in focus. I had to set the shutter speed at a certain rate because this is an LED screen, and the refresh rates will show lines and moire. If it's too fast, it freezes the motion of the colors changing. So you have to, have a specific shutter speed. The white balance was set to match the lighting up here on a Kelvin scale. And then really my only factor that I could play with was my ISO. And so I took that up until I got a proper exposure. And again, you don't need to understand all this yet, but I'm just showing you why you might eventually want to be able to control this. And then I also control my focus points. So that's just an example of where you might use manual, but we're not going to get there in this class. So just as a recap, your level of control is really broken into 4 quadrants. So where your camera controls everything, that's your green auto button. And just think of it like your iPhone. It's really no different than your iPhone. Here in your semi-automatic, you're giving the camera a hint. I want a portrait, I want a landscape, I want a macro, I want some action. But again, you have no control over what the camera ultimately gives you. There's a lot of factors that go into that. If you have the right factors exactly set up, you'll get what you want, but there's always lots of variables. And then if you want more control over the settings, but you still don't quite know how to control everything, you can set it by aperture or shutter, and those are the next 2 weeks of this class. And then the camera will still take over and do most of the heavy lifting for you. And then once you're comfortable with that, you can start doing everything in manual, and you'll find once you start with manual, you'll really like it, and you actually won't want to go back. But it takes a while to get to that point. Okay, so let's just jump to some composition principles, something you can use with your iPhone, with any camera, that will just make your pictures look a little bit more appealing. So one of the first composition rules that I think everybody learns is the rule of thirds. So in this case, this is an iPhone picture right here, and you can see I've got it broken down into thirds, okay? It's a grid. And I place my subject at one of the crosshairs here, and it just, for whatever reason, something that's not completely centered is generally more appealing to the eye. So you can see I've moved my subject to the left. I've moved my subject to the right. And watch TV shows and movies. You'll notice that when they shoot, it's generally off center as well. You'll start to notice these things. It's kind of a widely used principle. And then when you do shoot centered, it will be on purpose, and there'll be a reason. It won't be just because you shoot everything in the middle. It'll be because you're doing it because you want to do it that way. Now, eyes are really important. In-focus eyes, sharp eyes, and well-lit eyes can make a huge difference between a meh picture and a picture that just says wow. So making sure the eyes are lit up, that they have pretty catch lights, these are catch lights, and that they're in focus can make a huge difference on a picture. So I challenge you to start noticing people's eyes and the light that lights them up. That's going to greatly improve your pictures no matter what camera you're using. And here's a great example of, this is the same girl in the same light in the same spot. But here she's facing away from the light, and she has no catch lights in her eyes. She's got kind of dark circles under her eyes. It's kind of like little caves right here. Here, I just spun her around, and you can see, here's the sunset. She's facing the sunset here, so you can see the sunset and the catch lights in her eyes. It's gotten rid of the dark shadows under her eyes. Her skin tone looks warmer. Everything's a lot brighter, and the picture is 100% different, and all I did was spin her around towards the light and light up her eyes. So start to be aware of that. You'll notice when you're in restaurants by the window, you'll be like, wow, your eyes look awesome. You start to notice that it's pretty cool. Here, once again, just look for different perspectives. Don't always stand there standing straight up with your camera at eye level. Get down below. Look for a different way to take the picture, whether it's with a shadow, a reflection, through a phone. There's lots of different ways to experiment and get more creative with your camera, and this can even be done with an iPhone. So don't think it's just with your big camera. And here we're just shooting through some bushes here at the subject. Here I've got a wide angle lens and I'm getting up very close. Here I'm shooting the scene through the shadows versus the actual people. And then, so here's the assignment. I have the other video that explains it in great detail, so I'm not going to go over it here. If you want to go on my Pinterest board, I save a lot of tutorials, and a lot of the things I talked about here will also be in tutorials written by other people, and sometimes it can be helpful to see the same thing written by two different people. It might make sense a little bit more. And that's it. Just please don't share this. I've worked hard to write it, and I appreciate your time and your donation. Thanks. Bye.